Hey guys, welcome back to week number 4 in GRA-152, aka Computer Graphics 2, where you're learning Photoshop. Last week, we covered the sandwich assignment where we learned about layers and how to manage those layers on top of each other while we built up a sandwich. We learned about all the different selection tools that Photoshop has to offer to be able to select portions of a photo so that we could inevitably be able to mask them away or hide them. And we learned how to use the quick mask mode to tidy up our selections, as well as how to use the layer mask to be able to add a layer mask and hide individual portions so that we were non-destructively editing any of our photos and not destructively editing by using the eraser tool or hitting delete. This week, we're going to dive into the paintbrush tool and learn about blending modes. And so the easiest and best way to correlate this is if we look, a lot of designers and artists and historians over the past 10 to 20 years have been taking a lot of old photographs, right, that have been black and white photographs, and trying to give them some new life by painting them in real colors so that we could see what it would look like if we were, in the moment, in that time. So this is kind of an example. I'll throw this website up on the Moodle as well, so you can kind of get a good view of seeing kind of what this looks like. But there's a lot of great examples of how artists have been able to take individual old photos and kind of colorize them and again bring life into it. I'm going to use an example photograph that I'll post also to Moodle so you can get kind of into the swing of how you can do this process. It is not the one that I expect you to actually submit. I expect that you, of course, will choose a photograph of your liking from either Unsplash or from any of the other Creative Commons websites we've used so far in class to be able to paint. But I think that having this Jackie Robinson photo gets your feet wet and getting used to how you can paint. So let's go ahead and take a look. So we're going to do File Open. I have already downloaded this Jackie Robinson photo so we can use it. Again, the big thing for any type of photograph that we use, we need to open it and bring it into Photoshop. So make sure you use Photoshop first and then do File Open, and then we can open this picture. So let's go and jump into it. So we'll see this photograph. It's great and all. What you will see and notice off the bat, though, is, no pun intended, bat, is, of course, if you try to change the color to anything, you'll notice that pretty much the only thing you're winding up with is grayscale, right? It is a black and white photo, but anytime I try to change this to pink or blue or green or whatever, you're seeing only this gray change a hue, right? And just kind of slightly change into different changes of gray. So we need to go up to image, and this is true for most black and white photos. It may not happen for the one that you inevitably choose, but most of the time, if this happens, what I want you to see and experience is that if this happens, you need to check your image at the very top, that image menu, and then mode. A lot of the times, black and white photos come in kind of automatically as grayscale for the image mode, which means we need to change it so that it actually has color to it, right? If we recall back from Computer Graphics 1 in Illustrator, or even in Graphic Design 1, we can remember that grayscale means that it is black, white, and all of the grays in between, but there's no actual colors or no hues inserted in between. So we need to use a color mode that works. And so we're going to use this on the computer. It's not going to be printed off, which means our go-to image color mode is going to be RGB color. If we were wanting to print this, then we would, of course, choose CMYK color. But for this, we're going to choose this and use it on the screen, so we're going to choose RGB color. Once I choose that image color mode, notice that I can now change these colors, and I will be able to choose anything that I want, right? So we officially have color back in this photo, and I'll be able to paint with it. So image mode, make sure that it is on RGB color. Next step, right? The big thing I want you to make sure you start off of is that you are not going to unlock this background layer. This background layer needs to remain locked. We are not painting directly on the photograph. If we were to look at any of these photos, right, what you're seeing essentially is you're seeing paint layers on top of the original black and white photo. Okay, so that means that we need to be able to adjust a lot of different values, such as like the opacity, and use blending modes to be able to blend those layers down to the original photograph, which means do not ever paint on the background layer. Cool. So let's look at this. We need to make a new layer, right? So of course we're going to go down to our new layer icon down here at the bottom right. We're going to go ahead and click it. We've got a layer 1, it's blank. That means that there is nothing on that layer. If I were to hide my background with the photograph, we would see layer 1 is literally nothing. I'm going to turn this back on. I'm going to double click on layer 1 and I'm going to call this hat because we're going to zoom in and we're going to focus on his hat for a second so you can see how this works. So I'm going to do Command plus. I'm going to zoom in, maybe not that far. I'm going to zoom in. I'm going to scroll, or I can take this and scroll, or I can hold spacebar and be able to pan up to his hat. Okay, so with the hat layer selected, it's really important that you have the layer you want to paint on selected, right? So not the background layer, but clicking on the hat layer. I'm going to choose the color, so I know that this hat is supposed to be kind of a dark Duke blue kind of ish, right? And so I'm going to choose a blue that kind of fits. I'll go right about there. And then I'm going to go click on my brush tool. With my brush tool selected, I want to make sure that it's brush, it's not pencil, it's not color replacement tool, it's not mixed brush tool, but it's brush tool, right? So that is also chosen by hitting your B key if you want to have a quick shortcut to get there. It looks like that little brush. And then we're going to go change the options for this for a quick sec. We want to make sure that it's set correctly before we get started. So from the get-go, we want to make sure that our brush tool is set to a 100% hardness, right? If it is anything lower than 100%, we want to bump that all the way up to 100%. We want a hard brush for this to be able to work. A hard brush is going to give us a solid edge around our brush when we paint. We don't want anything soft because we don't want it wisping away, right? We want to have a crisp edge when we paint. Along with that, we want to make sure that our mode is selected to normal. It is not going to be changed to anything up here. So you're not changing anything with your brush tool except for just making sure that your hardness is set to 100%. If you ever notice that your paintbrush is acting weird, which is the most common thing I feel like students usually mention. It's like, wow, this is giving me like a weird blocky texture, or this is giving me a weird, like it's inverting the color or something. Check your mode, right? Check your mode, check your opacity in the options bar for your brush tool. It might be that you accidentally clicked and changed the blending mode for the brush itself, or you might have changed the opacity. You might have changed one of these other features. So just make sure that, again, it says normal and 100% for hardness. So you can go up and change your size, right, for your brush tool up here. If we were to want to go, we could individually change the brush tool up here and try to make it smaller or make it bigger. But I'm always a fan of keyboard shortcuts. And if you look down at your keyboard for a sec, of course, the way to make a brush bigger or smaller is located directly underneath your minus and your plus keys. If you look, there are two brackets, a left bracket and a right bracket. They are directly underneath your minus and your plus key. And so the left bracket makes your brush smaller. The right bracket makes your brush bigger, right? So I'm going to go with that size of the brush, and I'm going to go ahead and start painting on the hat layer. Obviously, if I were to click and paint and draw with this, we're going to notice really quickly that this does not look like it's going to merge, right? It just looks like a solid chunk of color, right? Just solid color. Looks like Microsoft Paint. The beauty of Photoshop, and the thing that's really cool about it compared to Microsoft Paint and just basic paint level software, is that as we have this layer and it is just a solid chunk of paint, notice if I turn off my picture, literally just paint, right, is we have this thing called blending modes. And so in our layers panel, blending modes are located right there where we see normal, right? Blending modes allow us to blend a layer, right? And we're blending that layer with anything that's below it. So if I were to hover over each of these, you would start to see kind of how each of these blending modes operate in different types of ways, right? So if it's a lighten or a screen, notice that these are a lot lighter, right? If it's overlay or soft light or hard light, notice that a lot of these are kind of brighter but also like darker, right? These literally right here, dark into darker color, are literally darker. And then of course, if we were to go down to like differences and exclusion, we'd notice that it's going to give like the invert selection of kind of across the color wheel, different colors versus like this is blue, so it would give like a yellow for some of these, right? And then hue, saturation, color, luminosity. I would say for this project, the best typically works out to be overlay, multiply, and sometimes soft light, maybe hard light, depending on like the brightness of the image. But overlay and multiply are your two best bets, right? Multiply is pretty dark, and I'll acknowledge that. The easiest combination, right? If we don't like how something looks, we can always take multiply, and we can always turn down the opacity of the layer, right? So if I wanted, I could also turn this down and kind of combine the effects of a blending mode along with a lower opacity, right? So making it see-through. So if I turn off the photo, you can see now, instead of a solid chunk of paint, this paint is blending down to anything that's below it, but it's also slightly transparent, right? The opacity has been turned down. So if I turn it down to, let's go with 55, right? And I turn this back on, right? It's muted, it's a little bit lighter, it's not as dark, it kind of matches with kind of what it might look like. Again, how bright you make something or how dark you make something is kind of your personal choice as the designer, how you're going to take that black and white photo and turn it into a color photo. Those individual choices are kind of on you, okay? So as I paint, it's going to be very clear and obvious that as I paint, I'm going to go over the edge of things, right? So for instance, this white for this B logo is not actually going to be blue, right? His face is not blue. The sky is not blue, right? And so what I want you to see of what you can easily do, if I were to zoom out for a sec, do Command minus, is I can go and I can easily paint individual pieces. So for instance, this hat, right? And kind of what we talked about last week, Photoshop is easy to manipulate once you get used to the tools. So as I'm painting with my brush tool, I'm okay with going over the edges and painting over the edges because inevitably, if you think about it, this layer is just paint, which means all I have to do to tidy it up is use the opposite of a paintbrush, which is the eraser tool, right? If I'm going to paint and I don't want the paint to exist, I use the eraser tool and erase away the paint, right? So if I click the eraser tool, notice the eraser tool shortcut is E, so eraser E, brush B. Make sure that, again, you're on the hat layer. You haven't changed from that. As you zoom back in with Command plus, let's say, for instance, these areas on his head, right? The eraser tool acts like a brush. You can see that with the circle icon. So I can size it up with my right bracket. I can size it down with my left bracket. If we were to look also in the options panel, we want to make sure that the hardness is at 100, just like the paintbrush. We don't want a soft edge around the eraser, right? So we're going to erase the paint that's overlaid onto his face. As we erase that, you want to take your time and you want to make sure that you get as close as possible, knowing that if you accidentally go over something and you're like, oh crap, I erased the paint that was there, you could always do Command Z to undo it. Alternatively, let's say you accidentally do it and you come back to it, you could also bounce back to your brush tool, hit the B key, you've still got that same exact paint right there, and then paint it back. Right, so you can basically bounce back and forth between B and E, brush and eraser, and just kind of go back and forth, right? So if you accidentally paint something, okay, fine, use the eraser, paint it away. If you accidentally erase something, grab your brush tool and paint it back, okay? So don't be afraid of being able to go and spend some time being able to paint away, right? If it's something like this B, make the brush small, and go in and paint it away, right? That B should be showing through and should be the color that it was meant to be, okay? So that's kind of the gist of working with the paintbrush and the eraser for this project, right? You're going to bring back the color for this photo. One of the big things you want to do is, obviously, you need to save often. And so my biggest recommendation for this project is, first off, File, Save As first. Save it as a Photoshop document, right? So we're going to save on your computer. We're going to make sure it's a PSD, which it is, Photoshop, boom. I can do N Global. I can do this for Jackie, for this one, for the Jackie practice, right? And then save it to my downloads so that I have that PSD. We don't want to save it as a JPEG until the end, Okay, we want to make sure that we have the Photoshop file to work with throughout, which means we have all of our layers. Okay, ultimately we want all of those layers so that we can always go back and edit it and change it. Ultimately, a PSD is always more valuable to us than a JPEG as working designers. Okay, because if I were to go and if I were to accidentally, let's say for instance, export as a JPEG and try to reopen this and go back and edit it or change it or fix it after the fact, let me show you what's going to happen. So I'm going to export out. I'll export that as a JPEG down to my downloads, right? If I were to try to go open that now, right? So we have the Jackie practice. Let's say, for instance, I saved my work and I want to go back. Notice that that color now has been merged down, so we can't go back and edit. There's nothing I can do to fix this picture after the fact, right? So if I've got paint over his hat and over the edge, I'm kind of out of luck, okay? So make sure that you save as a Photoshop file, and make sure that you are saving often, okay? It gets tedious in regards to painting, but if you enjoy painting, you enjoy kind of doing it, think of it almost like a digital format of being able to kind of do like a coloring book, right? This is a really useful skill for a couple different reasons, right? We use the brush tool for a lot of different reasons, whether it's trying to select and be able to edit out things in the backgrounds of pictures, whether it's trying to recolorize a picture, whether it's us trying to do a digital illustration, okay? So get used to and get comfortable with the brush tool. Get comfortable with the eraser tool. The eraser tool works really, really well for this type of project, right? It may not work in the sense that I want you to use the eraser tool to erase out backgrounds, but it works really well in combination with the brush tool. Beyond that, choose a photo that you're going to be inspired by, right? So choose something that's a little bit more engaging than one single thing, right? We've used this website before in class, right? Unsplash is a wonderful, wonderful resource to be able to find images. My recommendation is do black and white. And then if you look, there's a lot of different options, right? Flower, girl, portrait, nature, photography. So if I choose photography off the bat, remember again, there are free photos, so don't spend any money on the ones that are fully there. But find something that's engaging, right? If you wanted to, for instance, use this photo, remember you just have to click it, download it for free, and then open that photo directly inside of Photoshop to be able to edit it, right? So if I go in here and I do File Open, we can then start that project. Use Jackie as your reference, but do not submit Jackie, right? I don't want this photo, the one that I was showing you through. That's not the project I want you to turn in, only for you to kind of get used to how to do the process, right? So just make sure that whatever you choose, you're engaged with, you enjoy it, you appreciate of what you're trying to paint. Challenge yourself, right? Again, don't just choose like the simplest picture just because. Choose something that is relevant, something that is engaging to you. Choose something that is also a photograph. I've mentioned this to a lot of classes prior. But we're not looking at illustrations. We're not looking at cartoons. We're not looking at 2D images. We're looking at wanting to repaint photographs and bring life to a photograph that is black and white. Okay. Thank you guys so much for this project. Thank you for this week. I hope that you have a great time. If you have any questions, as always, please reach out and ask either during class or outside of class on Slack or an email. But have a wonderful and fantastic rest of your day.